My name is Archie D. Rodgers, Jr., and I went out to the National Guard Armory in Sumter, South Carolina, which was my home at that time, in 1933. And I enlisted in Battery E of the 115th Field Artillery, which was a French 75 outfit. And I stayed in that unit until we were ordered to active duty on the 27th day of January, 1941. At that time, the 178th Field Artillery Regiment had been selected to be a part of the 13th Field Artillery Brigade, which of course was regular Army. They had checked our unit at summer encampment in 1938, and we didn't know it, but they were trying 4 or 5 of the artillery battalions in the United States to see if they wanted to let this general in the 13th Brigade make the choice of which one he wanted to select. That was in Louisiana maneuvers. And when we got back, well, of course, they made a report to us at the headquarters that we were going to be selected. And we were notified, of course, a month or 2 in advance that our mobilization date would be 27th of January, 1941. At that time, we reported to the each individual armory, hometown, and we started off being taught to be regular Army soldiers rather than National Guard soldiers. And we stayed there for a period of 7 days. Now, they were building the barracks area that we were to live in at Fort Bragg, and they hadn't completed them, so we had to stay there for 2 or 3 extra days. I think we stayed there 7 or 9 days because they didn't have barracks to move us in. Well, the colonel got a little antsy, and since I was a staff officer, he said, Red, form a closeness together, you know, in the National Guard. Red, you go and take my Jeep and go to Fort Bragg and find out when we're going to get those barracks. And he says, he gave me his telephone number there at the armory, which of course I knew. And he said, when you find out, call me, and we'll take it from there, and you just wait and we'll come up. So I drove up there, had this driver drive me up to Fort Bragg, and I found Smoke Bum Hill, they called it, and I finally located a bunch of carpenters, and I went in, I said, can you tell me where the 178th Artillery is going to be located? He says, they're going to be a couple barracks down. They have a foreman over there. You can go over there and talk with him. So I went over, and when I got there, there was only one person walking around, and this was the foreman. And I said, sir, when are you going to turn these barracks over to us? He looked at me and he says, well, I have examined them and I have accepted them. The Army has signed for them, but we haven't had a chance to clean the sawdust and extra boards out. I said, sir, you don't have to worry with that. I got a commander there that's sitting on the anthill waiting on me to call him to put the column on the road to come to Bragg. I said, if you'll turn it over to me, I'll sign for it like it is. So he said, well, that'd be all right. So he gave me a form and I signed for the barracks and the mess hall that we were going to get, the orderly rooms and supply rooms, which we were to put the batteries in. And they were all just still sawdust where they had let sawhorses be around to finish up window frames and all. So I went and I got a payphone and I called the captain in charge of my unit there in Sumter, and I said, Captain Wright, he was really a lieutenant colonel at that time, but he had been the battery commander that I enlisted under. I said, anytime you want to leave from now on, I said, all we got to do is sweep the barracks out. He said, "That's all I need, Red, thanks." And he hung up. So, of course, I walked around and looked at the various buildings so I could tell him where they were when he came in. Well, they got there just about dark. And, of course, they had a big parade field between the enlisted persons' barracks and where our officers' barracks were. And so some of the supply people were first, and they were going to have to sign for the barracks. And so I took them around, and I took him around, and I showed him where each orderly room was, where the mess halls were for each one of the units, where the officers would have lived, and the regimental headquarters. And he said, "Well, now, where's brigade headquarters? I'm to report to them." I said, "You go right on down this hill. In the middle of that next block is brigade headquarters." They had already been there and put up their sign. And he said, "I'll go take care of that, and then I'll be back." I said, "Well, what you want me to do?" He says, "You stay in headquarters here, and these people come in and ask questions. As far as you can, you tell them where their units were." So as they would come in, well, I answered the questions. I was the first lieutenant at that time.
And what position?
I was the S2 of the artillery, the 1st Artillery Battalion.
Intelligence officer.
Intelligence officer. Basic training really started from that moment on. Of course, the regular Army had the evaluators with each one of the units, and they told us what the objectives were. And by being a staff officer, well, it was funneled down to us as to what we were supposed to do. Well, it wasn't long before they started taking us out. We did close order drill. We read the articles of war. People would begin to going on sick call because we moved up there in January, and there was a lot of difference in the temperature in Fort Bragg in January and in troops in South Carolina in January. And of course, immediately they started having sick call, and everybody started training with their individual troops. As soon as they could get around to assigning us areas in the field, well, the battalions would drive out there every day, and we would go into positions. The cooks would move into a mess area. You had to train everybody in the field as well as occupy the billets in the fort. And you had not a dull moment. You were in a class almost from the time you ate breakfast and got through to lunch. You were in a class as soon as they would turn you loose from dinner to supper. And then you'd go back and you started training within your own barracks area. Of course, we had been training like this when we went to field training in the units, but you didn't have such a tight schedule there as we worked under there. I don't remember just when it was, but we got a quota to send so many enlisted personnel and 1 or 2 officers to brigade headquarters, and they were not going to come back. Well, I had no part of that because being an intelligence officer, I didn't get involved as a company commander or a battery commander would. And when these fellows left, in about 2 or 3 days, we began to start receiving personnel who had been enlisted in the branch of artillery but had never been assigned. And of course, we immediately signed them out when they came down to our battalion area to take the vacancy of these personnel that we had moved out. One of the things that they started very shortly after we got there. The brigade was running an officer candidate school, and you were authorized to send 2 or 3 people from each firing battery, and they were going to be trained as officer candidates under brigade control as replacements for any officers that we would lose. And there was constant turmoil. You were getting people in all the time, you're training people, you're moving people out. Of course, every time you had a move out a sergeant, you had to replace him in the unit. Well, the senior people were being qualified within a unit. The battery commander immediately knew who he was going to put in that slot. So it was a turmoil all the time with never a dull moment in training. When we went in the field, of course, they learned to move by battalions. The battalions learned how to assign training areas to the artillery units. The artillery units would move constantly from one position. You may only stay in and get your tent set up, your mess hall set up. They would immediately move you to another area constantly. Well, this, of course, was part of all of the training that we wanted to do. Then we started having service practice. We started receiving live ammunition. We were firing people on small arms ranges. We were sending people to chemical warfare schools. We were trying to train cooks and bakers. And so you were going, training all of the time. And of course, the longer we stayed there at Bragg, the better we got. We learned to shoot, move, and communicate, which was the favorite slogan that our artillery people used to tell us. Say, well, what does the artillery do? Well, you move, you shoot, you communicate, and then you move again. So they stressed all of this. After we had been at Fort Bragg, we were anticipating the January of the next year coming up, because we were ordered to duty for only 1 year. Famous last words. I was at Sumter, had a weekend pass as a captain. My wife had come in an old Hudson and picked me up and carried me home. And Grandmama wanted to keep the 2 children. You know, they always wanted to do that. So I came in Saturday and we went to my house. And of course, we lazed around for Sunday morning, and then we got up about the middle of the morning, didn't listen to, TV was not in fact in 41. We had a radio, but I wasn't interested in the news. I was interested in eating a good home-cooked meal and her carrying me back to Fort Bragg. Well, we got in and I didn't even turn the radio on. We drove all the way to Fort Bragg. And as soon as we pulled up in the parking lot at the officers' quarters, I noticed that people were running back and forth, moving around. And about the time I pulled up and started to cut the car off, you know, you always have a blabbermouth in each unit. Well, our blabbermouth captain, who had been on duty that weekend, run out and rapped on the window, "Run your window down." He said, "Do you know we are at war with Germany?" And the joker turned around and ran back to the barracks. Well, here I was sitting in my car. My wife was going to have to drive back to Sumter. I didn't even turn the car off. I said, "Honey, I'm going to have things to do, and you probably won't see me." I said, "You go back home, and I will call you when I can get loose and tell you what's going on." So when I went on the inside, the major was there already, assigning people out. And he said, of course, I had to go start checking on units and seeing if this, that, and the other was done. And so as soon as they got all the officers in that night, the colonel called us in and gave us an officer's call, and he says, the first thing is you will not be separated. You're not going back to home station in January. You are now a member of the active Army, and you will be released when the war is over. Well, that was like taking a dose of oil. Going in expecting to be released. And so the unit had a quota that they had been sending officers who had not been trained at Fort Sill, which was the artillery school, out. And most of us, well, the officers on the staff had never trained with a section anyhow. So the colonel called me in and says, Red, you are going to report to Fort Sill, Oklahoma in January to go to artillery school for 3 months. Well, of course, that was all right with me. I figured all the training that I could get, the artillery school was the best place to get it. So I called the wife and I said, I'm being transferred to Fort Sill, Oklahoma to go to school. Do you want to go along with me and live with me for 3 months? She said, where are we going to live? I said, don't worry about that. They got quarters out there. If they don't have quarters, we'll live in a motel. If we don't get a room in a motel, we'll rent something. But I want you with me for you and the 2 children for the 3 months. So, of course, we closed station march order as an individual. We drove to Fort Sill. We reported in. And we started out. The guy says, do you have people with you? I said, yeah, wife and 2 children. He said, well, you better go into town and try to find you a place to live. And here's 3 or 4 places that you can start looking. They had a lady that was in charge of a kind of small USO there. She says, you go by her place, and if she has any addresses for you to look at, people have been calling her and telling her what they've got, an apartment or a house. So I said, all right. So we drove down there, and I got out and went in, and I told the lady I had a wife and 2 children, and you're looking for some place to stay? I said, yes, I am. She said, well, I have an apartment on the down floor of a house that these 2 ladies live in the top floor. And if you go by that, you'll make your own arrangements. So we went by, and I got out, and the wife and I went in, and the old lady took us around. And, you know, looking for a place, you're not too hard up. You just get what you get. So it had 2 bedrooms and a bath, living room, dining room, and a kitchen. I said, I'll take it. Now, how much is it? She says, you not in? I said, yes, ma'am. But I'm going to take it because you can't rent it to anybody else. I'm going to move in now. I said, I got to have a place to stay. So she told me what it was, because it was within reason of what you would get for your quarters allowance. And I said, can I leave my wife here now? We took the suitcases and mattresses and things we had brought down in the car, and I moved them in. I said, if I get loose this afternoon, I'll be back. If not, I'll see you. Y'all better find some place to get some groceries. So I went back out, and the guy says, well, no, you've signed in now. Give me your home address, and you can go back there. Do you know the telephone? Well, I'd gotten the telephone number. He says, well, you be back out here in the morning for Reveille. Report here. So, of course, I went back, and all of the troops, some of the boys were bachelors and were going to live right there in the nearby area. But those of us that were living in town, they gave us the poop about we had to be there for Reveille every morning and you'd fall in with all the groups and start your training. Well, I was overjoyed because here I was going to have my family with me for 3 months. Didn't anticipate anything at all. And so during the 3 months that we were there, well, they sent us to basic officers course, which would prepare everybody for, that was the first lieutenant to captain promotion, or prepare you for being in line to be qualified as an artillery officer according to Army records. And all we did there was we would go in and sit into classes that they had in fire direction, signal, mess operation, financial keeping, going out on the artillery range. Well, when we went out on the artillery range to fire, I had never fired. Well, yeah, we had gotten the 155 howitzers, and so I knew how to shoot, barely. And so when they seated us in chairs on a row, and the officer got up and assigned a target. He says, everybody figure your data. Well, I'd been doing this, you know, at Fort Bragg. So as soon as I got through, I held up my hand. He said, what is it, Captain? I said, I'm ready to shoot. He said, get up, come up here. So I went up, and they assigned me a target, and I read off the information that I had. He accepted it, and we were firing 105s because it was most economical to fire. And I shot the first mission until I had adjusted the target, brought in the 4 guns. We fired for effect, and he gave ceasefire in the mission. He says, where did you learn your artillery service from? I said, my first battery commander was a World War I lieutenant, qualified at Fort Sill. He said, oh. He said, you have had some good training. Go sit down. Well, consequently, before he went through all the rest of them, he found that some of them were scared to death and had never fired. And of course, that was what I wanted to do to finish my training. So every time he'd get through signing a target, I'd hold my hand up, put your hand down. I got to shoot a minimum amount because training, there were 30 people in each section, and of course he wanted to train them a lot. He told me, he said, quit holding your hand up. He said, you know how to shoot, and when we get around training everybody up to your level, then I will let you shoot. Well, I was happy to know that I knew that much about it. But we went through all of the training and graduated from the class. We had one little skirmish. They would have night classes when you started in a section to train. And if you volunteered, well, they would have one of the instructors come in after supper. So I had never heard what a logarithm was. Well, people that went to Fort Sill knew what they were. So I went into class and there wasn't a seat left. The class was full and we had 2 people standing up. And the major that was in charge of the class said, none of you people know what a logarithm is? He said, if you don't, hold your hand up. Well, about half of the class held their hand up. He said, okay, put your hand down. All right, Lieutenant, begin. Well, this was a lieutenant who was a qualified instructor. And he started talking about logarithms, and he never took a breath until he ended up with the final answer. And when he got through, he said, anybody don't understand what a logarithm is? Hold up your hand. 3 captains held up our hand. And this lieutenant looked at us and said, I know he was going to say, you dumb clucks, well, how did you get up here? The major said, wait a minute, Lieutenant. Anybody that's never heard of a logarithm before, hold up your hand. Well, there were about 15 in the class that held up our hands. He said, take your little books and let's go in the next classroom. Lieutenant, you teach the rest of the class. So we went in, and this was an old major in the artillery. He said, now, you folks don't know nothing. You got a little red book that says logarithms. He said, open it to page so-and-so, look in your drawer and get 3 paper clips. Close your drawer. He said, now put a paper clip on this page. Now go to a certain page and put the second paper clip on. So we did. Go to the 3rd page and put a paper clip on. He said, now as far as that lieutenant is concerned, you people know what a logarithm is. Now, when you're working in artillery, what do you need to know to hit the target? You need the range. Okay? Where do you get your range from? You get it from survey. Okay. Now look at the first paper clip. He said, now, this is distance in yards or meters in this book up to that second paper clip. So he called out a figure, and he sent a couple of us to the blackboard. And he called out a number. Well, I'm good at looking up numbers. Run down there and find number so-and-so, write it on the blackboard. Had about a 6 or 7 digit, like a Social Security number. He said, Captain, you now know how to look up a logarithm on a range. So we all did that for about 15 minutes. Go to the second paper clip. He said, now, what do you do when you're figuring out how to move from the aiming point around to your target? You look through your field glasses or your aiming circle, and you get distance. You get angles converted to mils, because the artillery shoots in mils. He said that paper clip on that second table is from 0 round to the distance that you measure in, not degrees, it's not in degrees, it's going to be in mils. He said, all right, go to the blackboard. He called out a figure, and everybody run down the first column. 4 or 5 of us got it right. He called out another figure. He said, now you know how to convert what the survey officer or your field glasses give you in mils when you move over. Okay. He said, now, there's one other logarithm that you go get from the survey officer of the coordinates. Now, you go to that one, the 3rd one, and he taught us how to do that. But we went to class like smart alecks the next morning, and this lieutenant signed everybody to a little section of board about like this. And so we went to the blackboard, happy and dumb. He says, all right, I want the logarithms for such and such a distance. And by the time he got through telling us to it, I had written the thing out, looked in my little red book at the first paper clip, run across there, copied it. And I wouldn't move and I wouldn't hold my hand up because I didn't want to be a sucker. He said, well, Captain Rodgers, move out of the way so I can read what you've got on the blackboard. So I moved out of the way. He said, now does anybody else in the class agree with Captain Rodgers? Well, there were 4 or 5, thank goodness, hands went up. He said, now let's check the book to see if he's right. And he was thinking we were going to be wrong. He said, Captain Rodgers, that's right. It made him mad. First, because I was redheaded. Second, I was an arrogant first lieutenant. And he didn't know, well, he knew me from the night before. So when the class was over, he called me up then. Says, Lieutenant, are you trying to embarrass me?
You mean captain?
Huh?
You
Yeah.
mean captain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said, no. He said, well, last night you didn't know what to do when we said something about logarithm. I said, Lieutenant, I don't know anything but 3 paper clips. One's for distance, one's for angles, and one is for coordinates. He said, you just trying to be a sharpie. I said, no, Lieutenant, but I'll tell you what. When you call them out, I can do them. I know basic mathematics, and that's all I need to know to get my class. I maxed the thing because it was very simple, the way the major explained it. And he called me in after I had graduated. He says, you learned mathematics someplace down the line. I said, Lieutenant, I never heard until your first night what mathematics are. But you couldn't. I said, Lieutenant, don't tell me what I can't do. I still can't tell you what a logarithm is, but I can work basic arithmetic, and if I can get the answer, I don't care where I get it from. And so I graduated. In the meantime, the unit had completed training at Bragg because they wanted division-size units up there. And when you got an artillery unit trained, you could be transferred away as a regiment. The unit had already been transferred to Camp Blanding, Florida, because they had a large impact area down there, which was what we needed. So they transferred the 13th Field Artillery Brigade from Fort Bragg, complete, which consisted of the 13th Field Artillery Brigade, the 1st Observation Battalion, which was from the regular Army, the 17th Field Artillery, which was 155 howitzers, just like we were, regular Army, and the 36th Field Artillery, which were 155 rifle. So that made, we made 3 artillery battalions of 155 howitzers, 3 regiments of 155 howitzers, 1 regiment of 155 rifle, which was the long toms. The 1st observation, which we're going to do all the surveying to send to us, and brigade headquarters, which was to be in charge of us and any other additional artillery units that would be assigned. So we stayed down there, and when I went back, of course, immediately we were doing service practice. Every day we could get ammunition. And the first day out, the first mission out, I got my information and I held my hand up. I was beginning to be bold. The colonel looked at me. He was in charge of the firing point. Says, Captain, by that time I was a captain. Said, Captain Rodgers, are you sure you've got the right data? I said, try me, Colonel. I went up there, and I was within the measuring with my field glasses, I was within about 15 or 20 mils, and you shake sometimes with field glasses. So I was lucky. I was that close. I was within about 500 or 600 yards of my estimation, which is close for artillery. And so he let me shoot it. But when I got through shooting it, I was shooting at an oak tree, which engineers had lopped and let the base be towards the observation point, and the tree was on out. Well, I took the last round, and since it was over and the smoke came from beyond where I could see the leaves, I sensed it as target. Well, he was a sticker. When we got through, he says, Captain Rodgers, go get in my vehicle. And I wasn't smart. I went and got in the vehicle, and then when we got to the road, he told the driver, said, take a left. The driver said, sir, that's the impact area. He says, I know. I've called range headquarters and everybody's through firing, and I want the captain to learn something. So we drove out in the impact area. We drove along, and he drove along, and he finally pulled up and stopped, and here was a great big oak tree about 100, 200 yards up the hill. He said, "Lieutenant, Captain, I mean, now I want you to walk to that tree, and when you find a fresh, throwed up pile of dirt, stand in the middle of the hole and hold your hand up and holler, 'Here!' and then I will send you instructions." Well, I got up there. I said, "I know I can find a hole underneath them leaves." I crawled with officers' riding boots underneath that tree for about 30 minutes looking for dirt. I couldn't find nothing. I got out. He circled his hand like that, so I started walking. I walked in circles, and I finally got about 150 yards further than the tree. Here was a fresh hole, a big one, 155. I got in the middle of it, and I held my hand up. I lost my bracket, though. I said, "Here, sir." I went on, got in. When we got back to thing, he said, "Go eat supper, come to my quarters. Now I'm going to teach you how to shoot." Personally. One day we were out in the field on a weekend problem, and everybody, they still would let people go on a weekend pass. So the major and I were the only two officers that were required to be in the field. And a Jeep came driving up there, and we were laying around on our cots, taking the weekend easy, nothing to do but kill time and be there. And this officer jumped out and says, "Captain Rodgers, I'm glad you're here. You are to get dressed and report to Captain Bryan at the regimental headquarters immediately as soon as you, and don't come back. Carry your gear with you. Major Wilson, you are hereby ordered to alert each battery to send in to town and dig your troops up from wherever they are and report back. And as soon as you get everybody here, you are to report to the regimental commander at headquarters." He says, "Well, can I have Captain Rodgers?" "No, sir. You get people from here. He's going to leave as soon as I get him back down there." So I go and get in the Jeep with a driver, and we go down there. And three of us leave to go back to Fort Bragg. Well, the regimental adjutant happened to be the captain who was leading the party. We went down there, and we went into Fort Bragg headquarters, and we went to headquarters, and he reported in to tell him. And so the officer in charge says, "Well, now I can tell you where you're going to bivouac your troops. This is nothing but a bivouac now." So we went around, rode to the edge of a golf course down there, and he assigned us areas. Said, "Now, do you think you can get your battalion with all the trucks and howitzers and stuff in here?" I looked at it and I said, "You better give me another half a city block in here, because it wasn't that big an area deep." And so
Was this at Blanding?
this was at Fort Bragg.
Okay.
We were getting ready to. We had left Blanding and had gone up there. So I walked down, and driver and I said, "Now, headquarters is going to be here." And we picked out a space figuring for the trucks and everything in there. And it wasn't long before the troops began to come in. One guy'd come in and said, "Do you have an idea where we're going to be?" I told the driver, I said, "Take him down there and show his area." So we finally got all of our units in. And
what was your staff position at that time?
my staff position was S2.
Still at?
Yeah, still S2.
Okay.
And so we as soon as the battalion commander got in, he says, Captain Rodgers, go to regimental headquarters and they will give you word and you bring it to me. Direct to me, none of the staff. Bring it to me. So I went up there, and first thing you know, the regimental commander had an officer's call, and he gave us some instructions of what he wanted to do, and we went back down and we relayed messages. And so we were there. Second day, the supply officer came down and says, we're going to inventory certain supplies and we're going to ship everything we have, trucks, weapons. You'll end up with individual gear. That's all you're going to be left here with. And we get some trucks from motor pool. So the next day they took all the trucks, the drivers drove the trucks away, and they were brought back. The howitzers were all hauled away, and we started having 100% inspections. Everybody would lay out the duffel bag, and the first sergeant would get down there and he says, all right, each man is supposed to have 6 pair of socks. So you dumped your duffel bag out on the blanket and you counted 6 pair of socks. You had to hold them up and he had to see them. Of course, right quick, whenever I was an old service battalion man, I said, don't hold up a 6 pair. They may come along and take every pair you got. Well, everybody had accumulated extras, you know. So those boys were smart. 6 pair of socks. Everybody had 6. Put them in the duffel bag. So they stuffed them in the duffel bag. You're supposed to have so many pants. You hold up your pants. So many shirts. You hold up shirts. They inventoried everything that you will have and you put it back in the duffel bag. Yeah. Well, them suckers that left extra stuff out as soon as they got through, he said, throw your duffel bags on your back. Well, what do we do with this? Well, being an officer, you bought everything. Enlisted personnel, it was all issued to you. But them sergeants and them corporals ain't dumb neither. They listened to what I said, you know. So everybody that left goods fall in and they marched away. So anything you had extra above what the military said you should have, you had to tote it. But them people that left it that they lost socks, extra shirts, extra breeches, maybe a pair of shoes that they had brought. They were turned in. So during a period of about 5 days, this was the type of thing we did every day. And of course, when they weren't doing that, walk. You walked out, you walked back. You walked out, you walked back. So finally, they sent word, we were still up at headquarters, sent word down and says, all troops will be picked up at such and such a time in the morning at their area. I carried the word down there. The colonel sent the word on down, said, get on back. So we went on back, and we would carry messages back and forth during the day. So the next morning, well, everybody went out, and the trucks, empty trucks were parked there. We all crawled in empty trucks, and they drove us down to the railroad track. And here was 3 or 4 long rows of cars. So as soon as the cars got there, we went back to regiment. The regiment says, now here is the car number that you're going to put your units on. Write them down. Headquarters will get so-and-so. We went through and they told us exactly what we have. So we went down there. Well, they had figured out how many seats there were in there, of course, and you had enough seats to take those number of personnel. And in between different ones of the cars, they would have an empty car, which was a baggage car, which they sent the mess sections to, and they had cooks, stoves, and stuff in there that they would cook on. Well, that was where we were going to eat. Well, just before we pulled out, I was already on the bottom step, waving that our car was ready. We had 3 or 4 Jeeps come dashing up there. And I looked at them and I said, "What are you looking for?" These lieutenants says, "We looking for the 178th, we looking for the 17th. I said, "The 17th is on up here. You trying chalk marks on the car. 178th, get down here." I said, "All right, get on this car here." "Well, where are we going?" I said, "You going in and report to the colonel." "Well, how about our luggage?" I said, "Son, when I give the signal, this train pulls. And I don't know where we're going, but I can assure you that we ain't waiting on your footlocker." I said, "In fact, we don't even know where our footlockers are." They had been, loaded by quota and all. So we got on the train and we finally ended up someplace in Virginia. No, we ended up in Virginia. We got out up there. We again went through this old rigmarole about everybody having the right amount of equipment, and we were checked again the same way we were. And since I was a staff officer, the S4 had asked me to work with him because I knew supply. And we were working 24 hours a day. You slept if you got a chance, and you kept going back to the unit. Finally, when you got this unit completed, that was it. So it was about 2 o'clock in the morning when I got my last load of people clothed, took them back, and they said at 4 o'clock we load up on the trains. Well, of course, I laid down and went to sleep. They had to wake me up. I'd been working while the rest of them had been sleeping. We got on the train, and we left there. And the next morning, about 6 o'clock, we pulled into New York, which we found out after we pulled in. We were at the docks. All these trains were lined up there, and there was a bunch of boats there. Well, we found out which boat we were going to get on, and when you marched the unit up there, here was the first sergeant, and he would start at the headquarters road, "Battery Commander," and he'd call his name off, walk up the gangplank and say, "Here, sir." Bloop, bloop, bloop. You went till you got your last peon on. You carried your duffel bags with you, 2 duffel bags. Boy, there was some struggling going on getting up that gangplank, which is only about 36 inches wide, with 2 duffel bags, and you were tired. So we got on there, and as soon as we got on, they had officers to show each unit where they would go to sleep. And I finally found battalion headquarters, and I said, "Where do I throw my bag?" And he says, "Officers in the right next room there. You get the last cot." Well, everybody was already in there but me. So I went in and I threw my duffel bags on the last cot. They said, "Now, you know where you're at. Your duffel bags are going to be picked up. So you better get you a clean pair of socks, clean suit of underwear, your shaving kit, because that's probably all you're going to have on the boat." So they loaded all the duffel bags up. Well, it was an American converted cruise ship called the USS Wakefield. It had been taken from civilian service, stripped, bunks were welded in it and all, and we were each assigned a place to stay. Well, of course, we immediately found out where's the latrine, where's the mess hall, 2 very important things to remember. And where we're going, we don't know. So as soon as we got through, every unit was loaded. They pulled the Wakefield out in the harbor, and they said, "Now you're waiting for the rest of the convoy." Well, we were there must have been, within sight, there must have been at least 50 ships. Some of them were Navy ships, gray, and the others were gray, but were cargo ships. So within about 24 hours, we felt the motors crank up, and off we went. Well, we went so far, and of course, being an artillery officer, I kept my field glasses with me in my duffel bag. So I took my glasses and hung them around my neck and went up on the boat. And so we started to slow down, and I asked one of the Navy guys close by, I said, well, where are we at? He says, well, since you can't get off, we are pulling into the harbor at Halifax, Nova Scotia. I said, for what? He says, well, they have a safety net that blocks the harbor from the ocean, and they pull in as many ships as they can pull in there, so if the Germans are in the ocean, they can't fire torpedoes at us. Well, so we went in and we spent about 24 hours there. The boat cranked up and we pulled back out. Somebody, of course, the first question is, where you going? Nobody knows. So I went to the regiment and I asked my friend, the sergeant major, I said, Sergeant, do you have any idea where we're going? Captain Rodgers, I don't have any idea, but if I find out, I will tell you. Well, we were on the boat for about 2 days, and I went in there, and Sergeant Major pointed his finger at me and said, come in, I got something I want to tell you. I said, all right. So I went down there. He says, well, 2 things. First, I got a set of orders. It's on the mimeograph machine now, transferring you from the 2nd Battalion to the 1st Battalion. I said, hooray! Because the 2nd Battalion commander was not definitely a friend of mine. And when you're a captain or a lieutenant, you better be friendly with the colonel, because what he says you are going to do, whether you like it or not. And I had put in 2 requests, and he politely put them in the bottom of his end basket. And when I finally asked the sergeant major in the unit, I said, I put in a request to transfer. Can you tell me where the letters are? They're laying in the colonel's end basket. I said, well, what does he intend to do with them? He laughed. He said, he ain't going to do a thing. You going to stay in this battalion. Well, in the meantime, had run into the regimental executive officer, and I told him that I wanted to transfer. Well, he knew when we were shipping, so he said, well, I'll think about it. He said, you sure you want to do this now? I said, yeah. So, in the meantime, they had put in the request for transfer. While we were on the boat, I was transferred. And the second thing was we are going to land in Scotland and be transferred by train to bivouac areas. Well, we arrived at night, we unloaded got on the trains, we got on and we went to sleep, and we traveled all day the next day, and about the middle of the afternoon we pulled in and the trains unloaded, and there were a bunch of trucks there, and they hauled us to our bivouac, which were some English barracks. And I went with the service battery commander because he was going to sign for the barracks. And as soon as he got through signing for the barracks, he told me where I was going to be in our units. So I went around and got the battery commanders and took them there. So we got signed, and the next morning when I woke up, I went into headquarters, and the new battalion commander says, Captain Rodgers, Colonel Davis wants to see you at brigade headquarters. And you don't ask questions, you know. So I said, where's his office at, sir? Brigade headquarters. So I went over there. Well, Colonel Davis was the brigade executive officer, who was a Georgetown officer. And when I went in, I looked at him and he was smiling, and I knew it didn't bode good. He said, "Have a seat, Captain. How are things going?" He was a politician. I said, "Good." He said, "Well, I tell you what. Guess what? You ain't gonna be the S2 down there." I said, "Golly, you gonna have me transferred?" He says, "You're gonna be moved to the liaison officer's position, but right now, you have been assigned as the officer's mess officer." And I never have been scared of another officer. Rank didn't mean a thing to me. I said, "Colonel Davis, what have you got against me?" "Hush. You ran a good little mess officer while you were down at Camp Blanding, Florida. And now you're going to be in charge of the officer's mess, which is going to have an observation battalion, brigade headquarters, and our 2 units. And he says, now if you have any problems, son, you come back to me. Don't ask no question. Just go down there and take over." Well, I went down there, and I went in the mess hall. I said, "Who's in charge here?" They said, "Sergeant Patrick is in charge." I went to Sergeant Patrick and I reported, and I said, "Sergeant Patrick," he was a sergeant that I knew from service pattern, "guess who's going to be in charge of this mess as an officer?" He smiled, he said, "Captain Rodgers." He said, "Thank goodness." I had been anticipating getting one of them honorary first lieutenants down there. So I got stuck in the mess officer slot. Perham, P-E-R-H-A-M, Perham Downs Barracks, British Barracks, which was where our whole brigade was billeted. And I had the mess hall for the brigade headquarters, right, all the units. I thought, well, maybe I'm going to be relieved of mess officer. And when I went in, I got the double dose. I said, "Colonel Davis, what am I now?" He said, "You're in charge of the enlisted man's mess hall 2. Well, here I was going from about 150 or 160 officers in the officers' mess to 2,000 and something enlisted men in the regiment. He said, "Don't say a word. Go and tell the people that you're now the mess officer." And he said, "If you have any problems," I said, "I had a problem of having you know me." He laughed. But anyhow, I went back. Well, the problem was in operating the enlisted men's mess is they wanted to take troops out of the barracks and have them march up to the mess hall, but immediately go in by battery-sized units and not stay out on the parade ground where the airplanes would see them if the Germans flew over. But the officer at the time, it was a shilly-shally guy that wasn't very much for a schedule, and he let them jam up out there on the parade ground. Well, when I went up there, I told him, I said, "I will take one of your enlisted men up with me every morning for the first day, and when I send him back, you are to come at double time." Because I didn't want him ganging up there, and I didn't want Colonel Davis on my can. So in the first day, I straightened the situation out so that I would have an enlisted man come there 3 times a day. When the unit before got about halfway in the mess hall, I'd say, "All right, son, go bring your unit up in order." Well, they would double time up. By the time the other unit got in, they would run up, they would get in, and as soon as they got through, of course, they were granted permission to go out and leave. And it was quite an education being in charge of 2,000 people. But anyhow, we made do, and I didn't have too many problems at Colonel Day. One problem I did have to tell you about. we were working on Lend-Lease rations. Lend-Lease rations are meat. Things come from the British troops because they needed the money, and it was hard for us to get American stuff over there. So we started drawing beef kidneys, whole mutton lambs, which we never had before, and we had them sent to us, and you couldn't turn them down. You meant so many ounces of meat per man. Well, so many ounces of mutton added to a pile of mutton on the platform that we had to send down and pick up to take back to the mess hall, which the cooks then had to butcher and serve. Well, they had to look up in the cookbooks to how to cook mutton, because we'd never had mutton before. And one of them asked me, says, "Have you ever eaten mutton?" I said, "No, and I don't intend to eat it now." But I said, "You go cook it, because that's what we get." Well, we got mutton, and we cooked it, and the first day went pretty good. Everybody come by, the guys would hold the mess kits out. You'd drop a piece of cooked mutton in the mess kit. He'd go and sit down, and after he got through either eating it or not eating it, he had formed his opinion about mutton. Well, the next meal when they came in, we had more mutton. Well, that time they would hold the mess kit back where you couldn't reach it. I said, "Come on, fellas, we got to get rid of it. You can throw it in the garbage. We got it cooked," because we cooked it. Well, they got real smart. Of course, I hadn't had my first taste. Still have never eaten a piece of mutton. You don't teach South Carolina, dyed-in-the-wool Southerners how to eat mutton. Now, that's all right for Yankee fellas. But we did have a few people that came in that we had gotten from New York, Massachusetts, and of course we would fix one mutton a day and feed everyone in there that wanted it. And so the colonel came down one morning, and he'd whittled him a little swagger stick. He says, "You got too many coffee grounds." I didn't know what was in the cans. All I know was it had coffee grounds on there. And the mess sergeant told me there was coffee grounds, so I told him there was coffee grounds. So we went down, and he stuck his little swag stick about that deep in the first can, and the second can, and the third can. When it went down about 4 inches in the fourth can, I think it was, it stuck something. He moved it over a little bit, stuck something. Moved it over a little bit. These were 50 or 100-pound gasoline drums with one end off with a lid on. He looked at me and said, "Captain, you don't know what's in that?" I said, "No, sir." And I didn't, because I hadn't asked. You don't ask foolish questions. I looked at my sergeant and I said, "Sergeant, what's in there?" Well, he was smart too for a bit. He says, "I don't know." So the colonel says, "Well, I tell you what, Sergeant," we were in overcoat weather. He said, "Take your overcoat, slip your uniform coat off, roll your sleeve up to your elbow, and let's find out." Well, you always go with the program. So he took his overcoat off, he took his uniform coat off, he rolled his sleeves up, and you talk about hydraulic brakes. When his arm went down towards that slushy old coffee grounds, they got about 2 inches above the top, and his hand froze like he put on brakes. He said, "I ain't sticking my hand down in them coffee grounds." Colonel says, "All right, put your coat back on, Sergeant. Let's go on the inside." So he dressed, went on. We went in there, and he looked at me and said, "Captain Rodgers, do you have any idea what's in there?" The sergeant said, "No, Colonel, we don't tell him, and I don't ask." He said, "Well, tell me what you got in there." Whole mutton, uncooked, because we couldn't get a vehicle dispatching the motor pool to bury them. We'd buried them until they stopped getting the dispatch vehicle. I looked at him, I said to myself, I'm into it now. He said, "No, but why haven't you tried to turn it down?" I said, "You got a supply officer at brigade who's a major. You go ask him how many times I've asked him if I could quit mutton and porridge. The British ate porridge every morning for breakfast. And you get porridge by the 100-pound bags. And you do well to serve 50 pounds of porridge one morning. Southerners don't eat porridge. That's oatmeal, big oatmeal cooked. The British should eat it every morning. So he said, all right, tomorrow, you be ready right after breakfast. We gonna go looking. So we went, I got in the sedan, we drove over to brigade supply officer. Went in, I said, Major, would you tell the colonel that I have been in here and tried to turn this British rations down? He said, yeah. He said, well, what did you do? Because he drew them from somebody. He said, well, sir, I draw them from so-and-so, and he told me that I couldn't turn them down. He told you that? What was his name? He put his notebook out and he told him. He said, thank you. He said, by the way, if you get them turned down, let me know. He said, don't worry. Today, I'm going to find out who says you can't turn it down. And he was a full colonel. Went back and got in the vehicle, and we drove to where he went to. And I've forgotten, but it finally got to where we got to a brigadier general, American general. We went in, the colonel, of course, he wasn't scared of nobody. He said, General, my supply mess officer says that we have to eat these British rations. Now, I want to know who has the authority to tell me that we can turn them down. He said, I can't do it. He said, give me your name, rank, and serial number. Well, he was talking, the colonel talking to the brigadier general. So we ended up at a 2-star general's hut. When we went in, the colonel said, sir, are you the general that's in charge of rations? Yeah. He said, well, my mess officer says he wants to turn them down. Have I reached the right slot? He said, yes, sir, you have. But I want to tell you one thing. You don't get any meat if you turn the rations down. He says, well, can we get the rest of the stuff minus the meat? He said, yep. He said, as of the next issue, the 178th Field Artillery doesn't want any. The 17th doesn't want any. The 36th doesn't want any. He told them, everybody in the brigade, because he's running the brigade mess. Now, you sure we're not going to get any meat? You will not get any mutton. You will not get any beef livers. You will not get any, what's this you make the love, some sort of soup that you make out of beef kidneys. I had never heard of it, but I went in there one day and there was a croaker sack full of blood sitting in the mess hall, and blood was oozing out of it. It was full of beef kidneys. Supposed to have beef kidney soup. Anyhow, we went back down, and the next time they came in, no meat. But in the meantime, we had been picking up 4-pound cans of Spam that the Americans were sending to us, plus the mutton. The guy come in and says, well, you ain't getting any meat. I said, don't worry about it. I got 4-pound cans of Spam in that little building there that'll run out of my ears. I said, they haven't been eating it, but they're gonna love it. So we got no more mutton. I started feeding sliced cooked Spam, sliced Spam roast, whatever the cooks could make. These were old-timing cooks by now, you know. They could do anything. So the day after that, I got a call and somebody said, this is Colonel so-and-so. I'm a supply officer. I said, yes, sir, what can I do for you? Are you the captain in charge of a mess hall that can turn down mutton? I said, yes, sir. Well, how did you do it? we were loaded up and got back on the train, and we went back to Scotland. We loaded up on boats. This time we weren't lucky. We got on a British boat. Well, it only carried less troops, but it had about 2 regiments of artillery and some of the observation units on there. So, of course, as soon as we got out, we knew it was we were going to be eating mutton. And in about 5 or 6 days, we found out that we were going to meet up with the troops that had invaded Africa, and they had moved in and left a place for us, and we moved into Africa. We moved into Africa, and we moved into a place called Algeria at Oran. O-R-A-N was the name of the bivouac place that we were in. And then they moved us down in smaller units to a place called Sidi, S-I-D-I, Bel, B-E-L, A-B-B-E-S, which was a French town, which was the headquarters United States wide for Foreign Legion. All Foreign Legion troops were trained. That was that basic training place. So we lived there for a short while, and as soon as we could find a place, we had to wait until the troops that were in 750 miles to the front, they didn't have a place to move us in. They waited until those troops were in combat, and then they called and started moving us up. To support. So we moved the 755 March, and on the 13th day of March, 1943, we were in position, occupied a position with the 34th Infantry Division. We thought we were going to support them, but the 34th was just a major unit that would draw rations and issue them to us until they found a hole to put us in. Well, we lasted there 1 day, and we moved from there to the 1st Division. And we were informed that that would be the unit, the big unit, that we would support. We stayed with them a couple of days or so, and they assigned me to the Field Artillery Unit, which was the 7th Field Artillery Battalion, commanded by, I can't remember the colonel's name now, might come to me. Anyhow, he was a 105 outfit, but what they were going to do was give each regiment of artillery a 105 artillery battalion, and if they got enough 155s, they would sign a 155 battalion to reinforce that light artillery battalion. So we went to them, and of course I went down, and when I went in and reported in, the guy had 2 liaison officers. I was already a liaison then. He says, the colonel does not like liaison officers. He's got 2 over here, and you're the 3rd one, and we don't know how many more you're going to get. You see that tree? Hook you up a telephone over there, lay me a telephone over here with a telephone, and we'll operate it. And when we need you, we'll call you. Other than that, you stay over there. So I stayed over there. Well, about the middle of the afternoon, he had an officer's call, and I went over and I introduced myself, and he says, well, what type of unit do you have? I said, 155 howitzers. What's your unit? I wrote it down. He said, well, you go support one of our infantry units. And he says, now I don't like liaison officers. I said, I judge that, sir. So he says, when you get your orders, I'll call you. Well, we put up with that for about 2 days, and during that time, the 7th Field sent their liaison officer back there and said, have you had any training in liaison? I said, The field manual has got about 4 inches in there, duties of an artillery liaison officer. I said, I know that from memory. He said, I tell you what. So he took me off and he gave me some of the hot poop about how he had been activating. And he says, when your unit pulls up, you will work with us, and I will take you and let you go forward with me. So about a day after that, our unit was given a position. We went up, moved into position. They selected, and I went up, and for 2 days I followed this tall, lanky, Yankee captain, liaison officer, regular Army. And he said, now, when I start out walking, if I keep walking, it's safe. But now, it's up to you. You can hit the ground anytime you want to. But I never hit the ground because I've been in combat now. I said, all right. So we started walking along, and I heard way off to one side. And before his heel hit the ground, I hit the ground. And I looked up, and he started laughing. Hey, get up, Red. You don't go around when something's that far. He said, you go down when I go down. I said, I'm going to beat you to the ground every time. So we walked on. Another one come over, and I saw he didn't break his stride. I said, no ground hitting. Another one come over. Finally, one came over, and I heard it whistle, and I saw one of his feet start. And when he looked back from laying on the ground, I was laying there. I was a happy captain laying flat on the ground. He said, you've already learned something. He said, now when this artillery fires, you go hear artillery going over one side, learn how to judge where it's going to go. He says, but if it whistles, you go to the ground. Says, because if it whistles, it's probably coming straight at us. Now, it's either going to hit short, if we're lucky, it'll hit where we are, if we're unlucky, or it'll go on back. Differentiate between each one of them. So in one daylight period, we moved 4 or 5 different times, and every time I watched that joker like a hawk, and when he hit the ground, I hit the ground. The rest of the time I walked and stayed up. And so the next day, the colonel called us, and we went into position, and we were occupied a position on the 13th of March, 1943, and by that time we were with the 1st Division. And on the 26th day of March, our unit fired the first barrage of unaimed fire of 182 rounds using the information that his artillery gave me. So during that time, I went up and he reported to a regiment, Colonel Matthews, I remember that guy's name. He says, I want you to go with this regiment of infantry, and I'll not support them with mine, but I'll let you have all the mission. In the meantime, we had Germans sent in airplanes for raids. We listened to incoming artillery rounds. We had 2 howitzers damaged by fire. They either got close enough, caused the tires to be bursted, or the engine, the mechanism, which we had to replace. And on the 7th of April, headquarters battery lost its first personnel. We lost 3 men that were killed that were in an anti-tank unit. We stayed with that artillery unit, and we would stay with them when their regiment, when their division, though, was pulled out of the line, or were not the unit that was making the direct attack. Artillery never stays in reserve. If you were within distance of the front, you were always guns in position, ready to shoot. Somebody's going to fire. Well, we would move from the 1st Division to the 36th Division to the 34th Division, from one unit to the other, whoever was making one of the coordinated attacks. And so the final attack, though, that we were in Africa, we fired 8,765 rounds in that one attack. And that ended up, we finished supporting the troops that were moving into the seaport, which the infantry were taking. The Germans had run the Germans. The Germans had been forced out by the divisions as we attacked until there was nobody left but prisoners and boats of the Germans that were departing. And the Americans took over North Africa at that time. We stayed there for probably 10 or 15 days in bivouac, washing clothes and looking, resting, filling up on sleep, and we loaded up on an LST, landing ship tank, which was to carry our unit into into Italy. It took 2 landing ship tanks to load the 3 firing batters with no kitchen units, and the ammunition sections from service batter, and all of the fire direction sections from headquarters batter, and some of the battalion staff, and the rest of the unit we had to leave back because we didn't have room to load on. You loaded an LST by driving your vehicles in certain order, and there were 2 levels of the deck. You drove the jeeps and stuff, the light vehicles, weapons carriers, up on the top deck, and once you got them up there, you had to turn them around and head them back to go down this elevator. Then you loaded the bottom deck. Well, the bottom deck of that LST happened to have 155 millimeter rounds on the deck. Then the engineers put sheets of plywood, heavy grade plywood, and all of this was driven across to load our troops so we would have ammunition when we went in, because we wasn't able to draw the supply. So we went in there, and after we landed, we followed, we left. Well, we went in combat there for only about 30 days. The units were doing so well that they wouldn't let anybody but ammunition be loaded. Well, once we unloaded the ammunition that we had with the boat we came over, it was unloaded on the beaches. We would send back, and as soon as they got the beach cleared, they started bringing in the boats that we sent back would be loaded with ammunition. We went 30 days without a cook stove. The only thing that was cooked was a little Coleman stove, like a hunter carries, and thank goodness my liaison section had one, so my section had cook stoves while some of the rest of the people ate cold rations. They issued you sea rations, and you'd get them 3 meals at one time, breakfast, dinner, and supper. And so we ate cold rations for the balance of the combat. And finally, at the very last of it, they finally got our mess sections brought over. Everybody got sick. The first meal that they cooked for us, everybody's stomach was climatized to eat either cold sea rations, meats and beans, meat and hash, or meat and vegetable stew. Everybody went down and ate supper, was the first meal. And I'll tell you what, there was a bunch of sad soldiers because 50% of them ate too much because they had plenty, and we weren't used to getting cooked food, so everybody was a hog. But I had learned to eat the sea rations cooked, so I had warm food with the 7 people in my section. And anyhow, so much for Sicily. We again waited in the bivouac area, and we loaded on an LST for Salerno, Italy on the 27th day of September 1943. On October of 43, our battalion fired the first rounds in Italy. The howitzers blew. Finally, we received counter-battery fire, which was accurate, and we lost 3 men and 8 wounded from our regiment with the first big heavy casualties that we took. We moved slowly, supporting one unit and then another. We had been in combat there, and we moved forward, working with one division and then another. And we noticed that the 1st Division never landed in Italy. So I wrote a letter and sent it to one of my friends that was on the staff in the 1st, and I finally got a letter back, and he says, we are in our original bivouac area where we originally moved when you knew me. Well, I knew he was back in England again. And he said, we are training to be moved in. Of course, they were in the invasion, when the invasion came across from England into Germany. Anyhow, we stayed there and moved up from one position to another, learning, of course. We became better soldiers. They started a program of each artillery battalion, or each company size, each infantry company, each infantry battalion would receive a quota of 1 officer and 1 enlisted man from each company or unit, which meant that in an artillery battalion, we'd get 1 officer for the 5 artillery units, 3 firing batteries, service battery, and headquarters. You'd get 1 officer to go with the group and 5 enlisted personnel who would be selected, 1 from each battery. Well, of course, you hoped you'd get in and felt glad for the ones that were being selected, but it was supposed to be a secret. Well, one day I went in regiment. I was in between support units, and I went back to the regiment, and I went in, and the sergeant major says, I want to speak to you, Captain Rodgers. So he took me on the outside, and he says, do you know your names in next month's? I said, Sergeant, why did you tell me that? I said, I would have rather not known it till the day before, but I said, I think I have been in combat enough now so that it won't affect me. So I went back, and of course I didn't tell any of my people, but I started being more careful. He pulled out a yellow Western Union paper. You know what a yellow Western Union paper looks? Old telegraph. When he showed that color or that yellow thing to me, he held it by his leg. He says, Red, if you'll let me turn this telegram down ordering you to go back to the States, you're the senior officer, and if any of us get moved out, you will be promoted to major. I looked at him, I said, Colonel, I've been the senior major in this artillery regiment since we were in England, and none of you have lost your position, and I prayed for you that you wouldn't get wounded, but I tell you what, I'd rather be a live captain than a dead major and stay over here. Give me that telegram. I said, well, guess what, boys? I'm going to leave you fellas tomorrow. I have been ordered back to the States with 5 enlisted personnel. Oh, Captain, Don't leave us like that. Because I tell you what, if you ever had 5 people that you would like to have brothers that were close to you as your hide in combat 24 hours when you were lying on this man to scratch your back and you scratched his, that was the same thing as being a blood kin. Because when you moved, he moved. When he ducked, you ducked. When you ate, he ate. You lived as a small little section, but with another unit. So all the people that had gotten these orders before, they loaded up that afternoon. Well, I had told the boys from my unit, I said, when I get my orders, I'm going to come down here and tell you. I went down there. I ended up by filling a notebook with notes of people in Sumter that I was going to call or call their wives. And the next morning, my driver, my radio sergeant, drove the Jeep. The colonel let me take a Jeep, my Jeep, and the rest of the boys rode in a weapons carrier. So we rode down and we went to the port, and when we got through, I told the weapons carrier, I said, now you go back and report to the unit today. You just get back there in time to eat supper. I told my driver, I said, the colonel says I could give y'all an overnight pass, but now you better be back by supper time tomorrow, because if you don't, I will haunt you the rest of your life. I said, now I just asked him if I could give you a pass, but now I expect you to be soldiers like you're serving under my orders. Captain, thank you. We appreciate it. Can we leave now? I said, you're on your own. We loaded up there as an individual now. From now on, I was leaving the outfit in combat. I went back and reported to Fort Bragg again, and I was supposed to be assigned for a 1-year period to a unit in Fort Bragg. The replacement training center was there, had a vacancy, and I ended up by being assigned to the Cooks and Battery, because they had checked my record and saw where I had been a mess sergeant, and they knew I knew about it. So I went down there and I reported in, and I had a cadre of 36 or 37 people who were in my immediate unit. This consisted of supply people, administrative people, platoon leaders who were training basic recruits and units, and that sort of personnel. So that was my job then for a period of a year or until my next assignment came due. And so as soon as I was there, you had to learn your section people again. And by the time it come due for me to be available for orders, one night at the officers' club, I had about a year and 3 months. And I got a notice, you are now restricted to the base at Fort Bragg. You cannot leave the base anymore. Well, in the meantime, of course, my wife had come up and had got quarters there. And so I called her and I said, I'm restricted, but y'all can come out and eat supper with me at the mess hall. So there were a bunch of us that were occupying a table crying in our beer. And so we were sitting there, and I said, well, now, I can't complain. I said, because I've had 13 months, and I only had 12. And I said, I can't complain. Well, this one only had, he had 16 months. So far, everybody we finally got around. There was one lone captain sitting there. He said, well, fellas, I hadn't been back in the States but 10 months. I said, son, you crazy if you let them send you on this. I said, we're going down and get on us trains, and we're going to California, and we'll get on a boat, and we're going to end up by being artillery people in the Pacific. I said, now if you want to fight the Japanese, I said, so he said, I said, I'm going to talk with you. So I took him to one side. I said, you know anybody in Washington? He said, my mom works as a secretary. I said, I suggest that you go get a phone, call your mama, and tell her that you're on orders to go to California, and tell her that you ain't supposed to be on those because you hadn't been here 12 months, and leave it at that. I said, oh, now you can. He said, oh, no, I didn't volunteer to get on this. I said, you all signed, you know. Well, Monday morning when I went in, I barely got in the orderly room for my battery clerk said, attention, hut! And I looked up from my desk, and here come the tallest colonel I have ever seen. He walked in, he said, how many people's in here, clerk? He said, Supply Sergeant me. Get on the outside and don't let anybody come in until I tell you. Yes, sir. Supply Sergeant. So they left. He come in my door, and of course I stood up. I didn't have to call attention because I was by myself. I stood up and I saluted, says, give this sergeant your information that's asked for. Captain, give me your name, rank, and security number. I read him my name, rank, and security, of course. I stood at attention. He said, go ahead and sit down. He can take that information. He says, first, did you volunteer to get on this quota going to California? And I looked at him, and I ain't never been scared of no officer. I says, Colonel, do I look like I'm a damn fool? He says, Sergeant, put the answer to that question as no, but put down what he said. He said, well, how did you get on it? I said, all I know is my name ended up on it. He said, would you object to going? I said, if I had a choice between living and dying, which do you think I would do? The sergeant was still taking it all down. He said, okay, that's all. He said, I want to shake your hand. I said, Corporal Fager, I'll go talk with you out in the Batter Street. So he put on his hat and we went out there. Well, all Jews, I don't know how they can do it, can either get into medics or batter clerks, or clerical work. I don't know how they do it, but they just gravitate to those jobs. So I told him, I said, how about you go down to post headquarters and try to find out from one of your friends what's going on. Because I said, I'd like to know. He already knew I was on orders to ship out, you know. So he left. Well, he was gone about 2 hours, and he come back. He called me back out in the Batter Street. He says, Captain, they are in mass confusion down there, and I couldn't even get into the building. But he said the guy that talked to me was a master sergeant, and he didn't know nothing. But he told me to come back tonight when he was off, and he'd be on duty as a clerk, and he'd tell me. I said, okay. So the battery clerk went up there, and the next morning when I came down, we had been taken off of the alert in the meantime. The next time I came down, well, he says, you don't know the confusion that's gone on up there. And I was thinking, when I reported in, you go in, you signed in at a desk, you normally have a battery clerk, corporal, or at most a sergeant, says, give me a copy of your orders and sign in. Well, you just do what he says. Here was a major when I went up there signed in. Well, you keep your mouth shut and your ears open, and you learn the Army, so you don't complain. I said to myself, this major knows somebody. he knows something about somebody that I don't know, that I wish I did know, but I ain't going to find out because he ain't going to tell me, because he's still him. And so he says, that colonel came in there, and he walked in, and he went over to this major's desk because he had a sign on his desk, sign in, and he said he was getting ready to reach in his pocket to pull out his copy of his orders. And this major spun his tablet around and said, I need a copy of your orders, Colonel, and I want you to sign in. I could just see this old sergeant smile. And this colonel says, wait a minute, Major. Here's my ID card. I am from the Inspector General's Department, Washington, D.C., and you don't answer any questions but what I ask you. Do you get that? Major said, yes, sir. Well, you can imagine the consternation on the floor of sergeant majors, lieutenants, majors, maybe a bird colonel or two, and it got quiet as it could get. He says, how long have you had this? I want your name, rank, and of course, let me look at your ID card. He gave it to him, so write that down. He said, how did you get this job, Major? He says, well, a friend of mine. Who got you this job? Well, the general's son is a friend of mine. Did you get that, Sergeant? I said, yeah. He said, okay. Now, how long have you had this job? The joker had been there for about 2 years. The sergeant told me when he came back in for me to sign my original report, he laughed. He said, you would have jumped up and down with glee when that colonel told that major, a major doing a corporal's job? Son, you have been so lucky. And said, while this was going on, the bird colonel came down, who was the chief of staff for the two-star general, came down and walked over and asked him, said, Colonel, you are interrupting things down here. Could you mind telling me what's going on? He said, Colonel, hush. Here's my ID card. I'm from the Inspector General, Washington, D.C., and I do all the talking. Now, Colonel, you go back up and sit down at your desk, and when your turn comes, this sergeant and I will come up, and you might inform the general that I am down here. And he went around and he asked everybody's question. Same thing, you know. Well, the orders took us off of orders to go, and everybody that had been there longer than a year got put on orders. Well, the next weekend, we had our little crying table of officers out there gleefully gloating and knowing that we had been taken off the order. And here was a table of all those people over there, majors, lieutenant colonels, and captains that had been on the post for over 2 years. And they were all on that orders to go to California. Anyhow, suffice is, I stayed there until they had a class they called the Associate Advanced Class at Fort Sill, which was for majors and lieutenant colonels. Well, I was senior captain, and they sent me out there. I went out there, stayed out there again for a 3-month assignment, and at the end of the 3 months, I said, well, I had slipped in and talked to a colonel in the communication section, and he said, I need a new major to go in my communication, and I know you know artillery communication. Could you transfer? I said, yep. He said, I'm going to put you down to be an instructor. Will that be all right with you? I said, gee, that'll be fine. I don't want to go overseas. But they stopped that, and so he came to see me and said, no more graduates being accepted. You're going to be sent back to Fort Bragg. I said, here I go back to the replacement training center again. Well, I got back, and I knew where I was going to go, a battery commander in the replacement training center. And this time, I got the gun mechanics battery. This unit took basic training enlisted men and taught them how to be a sergeant in charge of the gun mechanics and did all the work. Well, I was happy to get the assignment, but I would lots rather gone back to the cooks and bakers, but somebody already had that. But I had more property assigned to me than any other captain on the base at Fort Bragg. I had more properties than colonels that were supply had assigned to them, because I had about 4, 8, 12. There were 12 artillery battalions in any battalion of artillery. I had 24 105s assigned to me that were in a shed over there. I had about 12 155s, just exactly like I'd been on. I had a couple of 155 rifles. I had a couple of 8-inch mortars. I had a couple of 36 millimeter guns, which I had never even seen. They were so high up. Army artillery had 2. And that was, but the gun mechanics had to be trained. On the 30th of, I went over and took a final type physical, which separated me on the 30th day of November, 1945, from the military. I was separated and was sent back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to whatever they would do. And that's where I took that other battery. No, that's where I went home station. And that ended my National Guard career until the war. After the war was over, they formed the National Guard unit again in Sumter. And by being a senior captain, because I never got my promotion, when they formed the National Guard, I had so much seniority as a captain. I was the first captain promoted in an artillery in the state of South Carolina in the National Guard. You know what? It's peculiar. You get used to a job. A lot of people live in a hometown, and you take a job that one of them might get. Boy, he don't like you. Just because you hold the rank didn't mean a thing. So I told him, I said, Colonel, I got permission from my wife, and I want to have officers call tonight, and I want to talk to everybody. He said, all right. So I had them all. I said, all right, now, the colonel has offered me the job, and I said, I've done talked with him. But I said, now I'm going to talk to you people. Why don't one of you captains take this job? I don't really want it. I said, but I applied for it before. And they said, one guy said, well, I'm a superintendent of education in Georgetown County, and I draw so much money, I can't give up the job. Another one said, I run a survey with my dad down there. I can't make as much money in the administrative job. I went to every captain, and he had some excuse. I said, all right. One more thing, Colonel. I said, I know this clique that you've got down there in Georgetown, because I said, we have had our fights between Sumter and Georgetown. We've had our fights between officers. We've had our fights between enlisted personnel, but we finally ended up by being one unit. I said, now when I go to Georgetown, I'm going to be working for Colonel John C. Heineman. Any order that you want me to take, you either give it to me, or you tell this individual here that you want him to tell me that you have said so-and-so. I said, now I will take the job under that circumstances, and if one of them comes down there and tells me to do something and you hadn't told him to do it, I got to get your permission before I do it. And I said, now you captains better listen, because you ain't going to pull no rank on no junior officer. I said, I'm working for him and him alone. And I said, we can get along because I know how to do any job in the military.